On tonight's show, we are so honored to have Tom Schimmer, an author of numerous books, including his newest book, Redefining Student Accountability, a proactive approach to teaching behavior outside the Gradebook. He is also a former classroom teacher, an administrator, a district level leader, and he's pretty much done it all. Tom is also the host of the Tom Schimmer podcast, a podcast about learning, leadership, and life. And it primarily focuses on current topics in the K-12 educational system. I was fortunate enough to be a guest on Tom's podcast, and I had an absolute ball. Tom has presented throughout North America and in over 20 countries throughout the world. Tom received his undergrad degree from Boise State University and his graduate degree from the University of British Columbia. I could go on and on about Tom, but we're going to get right to it, have a great conversation with him tonight, and hopefully you'll learn much, much more about the man who is just influencing our profession throughout this world. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome to a conversation with Brian, Tom Schimmer. Tom, welcome to the show.
Oh, happy to be here, Brian. You get to turn the tables on me this time, and enjoyed having you on my podcast. And now reciprocation is only fair.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I also appreciate you getting up so early this morning. It's a little bit earlier than my time, but as you said, you get up a little bit earlier anyway, so it's all good. So, as you might know, at the beginning of each one of my podcast time, I ask my guests to talk a little bit about their professional journey, their personal story, just so my audience can get to know the real Tom Schimmer. So, who is Tom Schimmer?
I'm still trying to figure that out. At 55 years old, Brian, I'm still trying to figure out who I am. But my professional journey began in 1991. I was a trained high school history teacher. I spent 7 years as a classroom teacher. Now, relevant to the conversation I think we're going to have today is that I was an incredibly traditional high school history teacher. I always tell people the stereotypical high school history teacher minus the costumes is what you should envision with me.
Really?
And most importantly, very traditional in my assessment and grading practices. I was the zero guy, the late penalty guy, the hammer kids in the gradebook guy. So it's somewhat ironic what I do today. But I reached a point in my career where I just became frustrated. So 7 years as a classroom teacher, 11 years as a campus administrator. And it was during that time as an administrator when I was an assistant principal in a middle school. I was teaching 3 out of 6 periods each day, and I was actually teaching 8th grade math at the time. I almost became a math teacher. That was kind of on the radar as well. So 8th grade math was kind of in my wheelhouse.
Sure.
And in that capacity, I kind of discovered, assessment. There was a renaissance with assessment practices in the late 90s and the early 2000s. So I discovered that. I started to change my practices, and 20 years later, the rest is history. So that's the 33 years. I spent 11 years as a campus administrator, 2 years at central office, and now 13 years as a full-time author, speaker, consultant. So that's the 33 years. But that pivotal moment, kind of 2003, 2004, 2005, that was a pivot point in my career, which really had me do a complete 180 in terms of the type of educator I was.
That's amazing. Let's go back a little bit. We'll
Sure.
jump to the professional piece, but let's go back a little bit about when Tom Schimmer was young. Tom Schimmer as a student, as a person, as a learner. Talk a little bit about your journey as a student, and were you the traditional great academic student?
I wasn't really. There's so much irony in my life. I'm probably going to say this word a lot, but being someone who has now authored or co-authored 9 books, when I was in the 7th grade, I was assessed at a 5th grade reading level. And I was not a struggling student in the sense that I was on the verge of failure, but I was a mediocre student. I was just kind of up the middle. I did enough to pass. I was, wasn't barely passing. I just kind of, C's, some B's were in my wheelhouse, but I didn't have a lot of passion for school. And so it's an interesting story that, my mom, of course, was concerned, my dad too, and my family, my sister, who's 10 years older than me, they're all concerned that here's Tom, seventh grade, but reading at a fifth grade level. What do we do? And so my mom and my sister hatched a plan. And when I was in the seventh grade, they bought me a subscription to Sports Illustrated
Oh,
because they
wow.
knew I loved sports.
Sure.
And, I've never written into Sports Illustrated. I probably should have, all of those,
A
just the
great story.
story, because
Yeah.
I would read those Sports Illustrateds cover to cover. And it taught me a couple of lessons. One is it's never too late.
Yep.
And two, it doesn't matter what you're reading.
Yeah.
That I read cover to cover, and I was reading, back in the day about, Julius Irving. I was reading about Magic Johnson. I was reading about Joe Montana. I was reading, Sports Illustrated. I was reading and just consuming it because I love sports. And that sort of brought me back sort of from that, and gave me a little bit of a passion for reading. Is I didn't love reading every book, but I loved reading. So that sent me into high school. I was a good student. I wasn't a great student, but a lot of it had to do with sports. I was playing a lot of sports. I played every season. I played every sport. So my parents were reasonable with their expectations around what I could fit in, what I had time for, because I was playing football and basketball and baseball and soccer and even a little bit of track and field. So all of that was consuming my life. So I was a good student. I wasn't a great student, and I wasn't really passionate about learning or anything like that. So it's interesting to me how my career has evolved, because I absolutely love this profession now and always have for the most part since I started. But yet it's kind of ironic that the way I was as a student.
It's always interesting to hear people's stories. And I love hearing different stories because it just kind of shows you how we get here. And we all get here with different paths. Um,
Mhm.
but, it just, I heard somebody the other day say something like, one moment in time can change the trajectory of a person's life. And
Yeah.
think about your mom and your sister. What if they didn't buy you Sports Illustrated or get you? I mean, it was really that connection. And although you didn't love reading, you love reading Sports Illustrated. And so you never know how that could have changed if that didn't happen.
Yeah, no, it's so true. There are those, and we only seem to know those in retrospect, right? We look back and say, "Wow, that was a pivotal moment, and that was a really great decision, or a really interesting thing that they came up with." They knew my passion for sports. I loved playing sports, and for them to sort of get, and that's not a very traditional view. Like, many would think the traditional view would be go to the library, get a bunch of books, and have Tom read a bunch of books, but instead, they thought outside the box. I mean, we're talking 1979 here, Brian, 1980.
Yeah.
This is outside the box thinking in terms of reading, and got me the Sports Illustrated magazine. It came every week, and I was all over it. I read every inch of that magazine, and all of a sudden, I started to become a reader again. I didn't turn into a straight A student or anything like that in high school, but I became a very competent student, and the rest is history. So you're right; these pivotal moments are so interesting to look back as you trace back in your life, different decisions that are made that really could have changed the outcome of your life.
Sure. In my new book that I have coming out, I have this attribute I talk about in terms of curiosity. And how do we pique people's curiosities? How do we
Mm.
help them make a connection somewhere? And that actually piqued your curiosity, Sports
Sure
Illustrated.
did.
So
Yeah,
that's
it sure did.
hey, when you talk about being that traditional teacher,
Mhm.
um, was it just because that's all you knew? And that's
Yep.
how you were socialized into the profession? Did you was there any kind of this disquiet, this angst that you weren't really doing something that you were supposed to do, or you just felt like that's just what I'm going to do because that's the way I was socialized?
I think it's better now, but back in the day, we didn't get any training on assessment.
Yeah.
Ironically, again, there's that word. One of the most important aspects of teaching and learning is assessment, and yet I had no training in assessment. So, of course, I start teaching in 1991, and what do? I think back in my own autobiography, and I think, what did my history teachers do to me? How did they assess me? So you just reach back. I reach back into 1983, 1984, and I pull those practices into 1991. That's how these legacies continue. It's
Yeah.
like they almost leapfrog, right? So I began teaching, and here's the truth. I became a teacher because I wanted to coach. I wanted to do something in sports. I wanted to be a professional athlete, or if I was not, that was going to happen. I wanted to do something in sports, and it was either coaching or broadcasting. And I decided I love the competition, so I wanted to get into coaching. And I thought, well, what better way to become a coach than to become a teacher? So I actually got into teaching because I wanted to coach, not because I loved the profession. I learned to love the profession once I entered it, but at the time I wanted to become a coach. So
Stop
for
right there.
me,
Right, just real quick. So
yeah,
when you say, you got into the profession because you wanted to coach, did you
yeah,
not equate coaching with teaching at the time?
no, not at all. Not at
Wow.
all. I didn't, I'm 18
Yeah.
years old when I decided what I wanted to do. I didn't equate the two. Quickly, you realize when you are a coach, you are a teacher.
Yeah.
Little different though, because you've got a field or a gym full of volunteers. They've all chosen to play football.
Yeah.
Whereas in school, for the most part, until kids get older, we force them against their will to take the subjects they're enrolled in, right? So they're forced to take science, they're forced to take math. So it is a different audience. However, it is still teaching. You're absolutely right about that. So I did what my history teachers did to me and did to us. I thought at the time, and I think this is something that's very important, is that when people use poor practices like I did, no one was more traditional than me. I hammered kids in the grade book, and I was kind of mean about it, honestly. When people use those practices, they often use them because they truly believe that that is in the best interest of the kids they're working with. Now, they could be wrong, and I was wrong, but it wasn't malicious in its intent. It was, I think this is what kids need. And so once I entered so for 6 years of my career, I was an absolutely hardcore traditional grader. There was no one who was tougher than me in the schools I worked in. I had no compassion. I just absolutely torched kids in the grade book. In 1997, that's when my life changed, Brian. And what happened in March of 1997 was my first child was born. My daughter Samantha was born in March 20th, 12:26 a.m. 1997. She was born. And that was a pivotal moment for me because I started to, a little bit in the spring, but more so into the fall of 97, I started to hear myself talking to my students and the exchanges I would have with them. And it made me incredibly uncomfortable because I immediately started to have this knot in my stomach thinking, what if my daughter's teachers say that to her? Now she's just an infant, but I'm already reacting to the fact that I've become a parent. Now, just for the audience, you don't have to become a parent to be a great educator, but I needed to become a parent to be a good one. I had to sort of see what I was doing through the lens of my own child. But then, as I often tell the story, I spent another 7 years in what I now refer to as my assessment purgatory, because I knew I needed to be different, but the problem was I didn't know what to do differently. So
Yeah.
I spent another 7 years toiling in that. And it was the fall of 2003, 2004, that school year, 0304, when I started to think about how I was going to change my assessment practices, and the rest is history. That's where it went from there. So it was in the career when I realized that I was completely off track. I needed to figure out what I needed to do differently. I couldn't figure it out. So I spent, 13 years as a pretty traditional teacher. I wasn't as hardcore for those 7 years that I described after my daughter was born, but I was kind of stuck. I didn't know what to do. And that's kind of where it went to.
Your story is not so unlike a lot of other really successful people who started off in one, kind of mindset and way of doing things, but then they changed, they evolved, and that's the beauty of being a human is evolving. Because I heard somebody, I think it was Muhammad Ali, said something like, and I don't know if it's the exact quote, but it was like, if I'm the same person at 50 that I was at 20, I've wasted 30 years of my life.
So true.
And so I think that's the beauty of what you've done. And since you've evolved, think about all the people, all the kids, all the adults that you have changed because of your expertise on assessment, and how that truly is a change. Because assessment, when people my age, your age, when they hear the word assessment or test, you know what they think?
Of course.
We're going to be judged. My heart, even today, when I hear the word assessment or test, my heart starts to, flutter because I get nervous because of the way it was done to me when I was younger. So
That's so true. I mean, we equate the word assessment with evaluation. And when we were in school, I base it on my own experience as a teacher, but also when we were in school, every move you made got scored.
yeah,
You got points, right? And
yeah,
so assessment became about point accumulation as opposed to looking at the depth of learning. So that put, every time, and if you dropped points, those points were over. That's why we had to go to our teachers and ask for extra credit, because whenever you lost points on an assessment, those points were finished. Like there was no way to make up for them because you got a 7 out of 10 or you got a 12 out of 20, and there was no way to make up for those. So you had to go to your teacher and ask for extra credit to kind of make up for those deficiencies. So it just became this anxiety riddled kind of like high stakes, every moment counted, and it was relentless at the time, for sure.
yeah. Before we get to your new book, and it's behind me, you'll see that it's all
I see it.
sticky noted up. You talked about coaching in sports, and before we get to your book, because I think it's really a great book. But what are your favorite sports? What do you like to do? What did you play? What were you good at? What were you not good at that you liked? What did you ultimately
Well,
want
Brian, I was good at everything. No, I'm just kidding.
to?
But I have to. I always say to people, like, I played sports. I'm Canadian, and so the coaching and the opportunities in the 70s and 80s were not the same in Canada as they were in the United States. And I'm not saying I would have been anything, but my favorite sport growing up was baseball.
Okay.
I was a really good pitcher, a pretty good hitter. And baseball was the sport that I wanted to go to college for. I wanted a scholarship. And I had, I'm not going to exaggerate this, but, growing up in my teenage years, I did have some tryouts. One time went to a tryout with a Yankee scout, and I was 15, and it was a kind of a cattle call, right? It wasn't just for
Sure.
me. But
Still,
they came to me and they said, we'd like you to go to high school, and if you could go to high school in Oregon, we've got some coaching for you. We think we could do it. Now, my parents weren't going to send me to Oregon for
sure.
last 2 years of high school, and we couldn't afford all of that stuff. But that, so there were opportunities for baseball. I played football. I was a quarterback for the most part. Played a little bit of tight end, but mostly played quarterback, and I was a kicker. And that's actually what I went on because I played soccer and I was a goalie. I learned to kick the ball out of the goal area, the 18-yard box.
Yeah.
And so they lined us all up in ninth grade. They lined us all up on the football field and said, okay, everybody needs to kick a football. And I kicked it the furthest. So I also,
You're
from
it.
being, yeah, I said, you're it. And so I kicked field goals, I punted, and I was the quarterback of our high school football team. And punting is how I ended up at Boise State. That's how I got my scholarship, was as a punter at Boise State. But I played basketball. I loved basketball, and I know, of course, your basketball background is well known. But I loved basketball. I loved everything about the competition, and every sport to me really added to the other sports. So by playing football and getting hit, kind of adds some toughness to you, right?
Yeah.
Basketball, the fitness element of that, and the quickness, and having to be alert and watching, whether it's defensive rotations or boxing out or just keeping an eye on your offensive player that you're guarding. It's all of that, right? Baseball was the mind thing. Like what I loved about pitching was trying to outthink the hitter and trying to throw them off, right? So every sport I played really contributed. And it's really, in a lot of ways, it's kind of sad when I look at youth sports today and I think about how early kids specialize and all these travel teams, and they're playing year round. I'm like, you're missing out. Your body needs a break from that too, right? You can't throw a baseball 12 months out of the year. You've got to give that rest. You can't take hits 12 months out of the year. You can't, there's all sorts of things. And this as an athlete as well, that I miss the days of the well-rounded athlete that played all this. I know they still exist, but so many parents and so many kids are getting into specialization before middle school, and they've got that one track of that one sport. And yes, they become very good at that sport, but I think they're missing out on a lot of things.
I think the other piece is the injury piece. And I a lot of parents saying my kid is getting injured or my kid is getting burned out because they're tired of this, right? And so I think your point is well taken that when we were younger, we played everything and we didn't play it year round. We just played different sports. And enjoyed it. I mean, I wasn't good at every sport, but I enjoyed just the competition.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things that, like athletes are better today than they were a generation ago. I mean, everyone right now, when you look at athletically, they are superior each generation, and that's how we evolve as human beings, right? But that's just the elite players who specialized. I think about all the players that didn't go pro, all the players that didn't get scholarships. You maybe could have got a scholarship in football or baseball or track and field, but you never played it because you specialized in AAU basketball since you were 7 years old. So that's the part. Like when you see kids I think what happens is the allure is that the specialists who are elite, they end up making it. Like they become these phenoms, whether it's
They're very
LeBron or other
familiar
players,
with those.
right? But
Yeah.
it's the other players that don't make it who specialized at 7, 8 years old. It's like you could have had a career maybe in a different sport, but it never happened because you never chose to play that sport. So it's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, I don't know what the answer is, but it is a shame that growing up, kids don't really sort of go from season to season. Because I used to get tired of football, and then it's like, okay, it's basketball season. This is
Yeah.
great, and then a little bit of burnt out. Now it's baseball season, and it just the transitions for me were always made the sports exhilarating because it was time to do something different.
In Canada, were you a big hockey person?
I
As
never played hockey. I
you're a
know,
big hockey fan?
I know we are required by law to pay excessive amounts of attention to anything related to hockey.
Oh,
But no, we couldn't afford it. I remember going home one day. We weren't, I don't want to, again, I don't want to be hyperbolic here. I didn't grow up in poverty, but I lived a lower middle class lifestyle. My dad worked in a foundry. My mom sold shoes at a department store. We always had food. But we didn't have a lot of money. We were not rolling in it. Let's just put it that way.
sure.
So, for me, growing up, hockey was a very expensive sport because you needed a lot of equipment. Whereas with soccer, you just need soccer cleats and shin pads, and you're good to go, and shorts. Or basketball, you just need some shoes. And then when I got into football, of course, the school has all the supplies. So for me, it was the equipment. And then my dad, working in a foundry, he had to leave for work every day at 6:15. He
Wow.
left early, left at
Yeah.
6:15, got home at 3:30, which was great, but he left early. So the problem was he could never get me to practice. Hockey practices are early in the morning at the rink, and we couldn't get there. So it was the money, it was the time. So I know it's embarrassing as a Canadian to say I don't really know how to skate, but I don't. I know how to ski, so I think that's my recovery. Is I do know how to ski. I'm a pretty good skier, but I don't know how to skate. But yeah, I love hockey. I mean, I do love watching hockey, and of course, it's part of the ethos of our country. We love the sport, but I just never played it. Played
You know,
street hockey. That's what I did.
yeah, yeah. As you chat and share your story, it really just reminds me. And again, you say you didn't grow up in poverty, but it just reminds me of these opportunity gaps that we have throughout, um, our world, and how depending on the finances or the experiences that parents are able to afford, it can really change or enhance the trajectory of a kid's life, because they have, like you said, playing different sports actually really gives us an opportunity to do different things and meet different people and experience different highs and lows of kind of a microcosm of life. All these opportunities give us the chance to find our strength, our passions, our gifts.
Brian, you just made me think of something that I've never thought before, which is if I was growing up today in the situation I was in with my family, I'm not sure that I would have got a scholarship. I'm not sure I would have had those opportunities because there's no way my parents could have afforded
Yeah.
AAU basketball. We couldn't have afforded travel teams for baseball. There's no chance that we had the financial means to pay for all of that.
Yeah.
And so in a way I was fortunate that I grew up in an era where you didn't have to do that. I mean, we had, there were summer games teams, what we call provincial teams, but there was no like year-round club teams that people were playing for. And I'm not sure, I've never thought of that before, but thinking about, what if I was in my situation growing up in 2023 or say 2020 or 2010 or whatever, I'm not sure I would have had the same opportunities athletically because I just don't think we could have afforded. So I think you are spot on with the opportunity gaps that you look at some sports like tennis,
Yeah,
where you think all I need is a racket.
it's very
But man, tennis is expensive.
yeah.
Golf, another sport, and how many great athletes are never given the opportunity to participate in those sports because of the financial barrier and the opportunity gap. I think that's a really great point, Brian.
Well, I think this is a perfect segue because I think that's why our work is so important, because we have
Yeah.
to help kids become literate and numerate, because this
Mhm.
gives them an opportunity to do whatever they want in terms of their eventual lives and careers. And so, Tom, you've written, like you said, 9 books, and all of them are great. This book is a little bit different from what you have traditionally written about, although we talk about assessment, and that's really important in your book. But this idea of redefining student accountability, and the idea of separating academic grades from behavior attributes. Talk a little bit about why you decided to write this book here at this time, because I really found it fascinating. I think it's going to be really well received, and I think it's important, especially when we talk about kids being employable. Some of those skills and behaviors, those are the skills that are going to keep them employable. You said something about the academic in your book. Academics will get you into college, but the behaviors are going to keep you in and help you finish. Talk a little bit about why you wrote this book.
I wrote the book because this is probably, and I say that softly, it really is the most controversial part about sound grading practices or standards-based grading. We have this tradition where a student in some elements would be penalized for a behavioral misstep. So late work is the example that we always use, right? You submit an assignment, it's 3 days late, therefore you lose 30% of your score. And so obviously in the work around standards-based grading and focusing on making sure that grades are solely a reflection of the degree to which a student has met the learning goal, we try to factor out those behavioral missteps. Now, over the years, and this is particularly skews high school and middle school, mostly high school, there is always this sort of call for we need to teach these kids responsibility. We need to teach them about the real world.
You write
We
about
need
that in
to
the
do
book.
all
I
those.
love the way
Yeah,
you
I
write
do.
about it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we can get to that for sure, because that is a thorn in my side. That's for sure. But it was the idea, and I think there's a fair question that teachers can ask. And that is, if we say to teachers, stop using zeros and stop using penalties and stop distorting achievement levels that way, a fair question for them to ask back is, what should we do instead?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So I wrote Grading from the Inside Out in 2016, and there's a chapter in that book called Redefining Accountability. And I go through sort of the idea of how we redefine it. What I mean by redefining accountability is an interesting word. It's kind of a loaded word.
Yeah.
Accountability for some people is code for punishment.
Yeah.
Right. Someone needs to be held accountable. That's code for someone needs to be fired.
Yeah.
Whereas what I'm suggesting is that we redefine accountability to mean I am answerable and all learning is mandatory. So it's accountability for the learning, not accountability for the behavior. We'll hold them accountable for the behavior separately.
Right.
But so the idea, and Brian, it operates on this premise. If you give us a student a zero, let's say I'm a student in your class, Brian, and we have a project due today, and I haven't turned in the project for you. In fact, I haven't even started. And you say to me, you have a policy that says, Tom, I'm going to hold you accountable. It's an automatic zero until you submit that assignment. Even if you say to me, Tom, it's just a placeholder. When you get the project into me, I'll give you full credit for that. I'll grade it. That night, I go home and I log into the online gradebook, and I see that you've already put the zero in there. And my grade has just gone from an 85 down to an 82 as a result of that 1-0.
Right.
I still have a B and I have an 82. And if I'm okay with that 82 and I'm okay with still having a B, you'll probably never get that project from me.
Yeah.
Now, I often ask audiences, in what universe have I been held accountable?
Exactly.
I've just been let off the hook. So we want to shift the definition of accountability to mean if that project is essential evidence, we want to make sure that we get that essential evidence from the student. And so I go into in that chapter, I went into how we put systems in place to hold kids accountable. Now, over the years, the question kept coming up, and I thought, you know what, I should take that chapter and I should write a whole book about it to say, this is what we do, and this is how it plays out. So that's where the book came from. That was the inspiration for the book, because that is, at the secondary level, the most controversial or point of tension when it comes to this work around assessment and grading.
Yeah. Do you still get pushback? I mean, with all the evidence that we have today
Yes.
and how much we know. And again, I'm reflecting back to when you talked about you were that teacher,
Yeah.
for
Oh, yeah.
7 years, you were that teacher. If you had Tom Schimmer come in and talk to you back then, would you have listened or would you have been still that teacher? And if you were still that teacher, how do you reach that teacher?
What year? 1992? No way.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
would have, I would have been what Adam Grant calls the prosecutor. So I don't know if you've read the book Think Again by Adam Grant, organizational psychologist, but he says when we face change, we should approach change like scientists and seek new knowledge and all that, but we don't. He says we slip into one of the other three modes, which is preacher, politician, or prosecutor. Just very quickly, the preacher is the one that preaches their pet theories with no research behind them. The politician tries to make everybody happy and placate everybody. The prosecutor is the one that tries to poke holes
Yeah.
and already has their rebuttals prepared before the PD session. That would
Right.
have been me. I would
Yeah.
have been at the back of the room, arms folded, probably making some wisecracks to my colleagues about how ridiculous the speaker was. Um, and that's why, when you said earlier how, life evolves if I'm the same person, I'm definitely not the same person. It almost feels like a different person. When I remember who I was as a teacher in the early 90s, it almost feels like it wasn't me. It was
Yeah.
someone else because I have changed so much. But yeah, I definitely I definitely wouldn't have been open to it. But I think the way that you help people get open to it is you have to, and this is very generic, so individuals are going to be different, but
Sure.
one of the things I've learned over the course of my career is that making just the technical argument about a change is insufficient.
Yeah.
Change is more emotional than it is clinical.
Sure.
And so you can make all of the arguments you want, the technicalities, here's what the research says, here's all of that. Now, where things change for me as a speaker and a consultant and an author is not only having a firm grasp of all of the technicalities about how grades get distorted and all of that. When I started years ago, and I'm talking, 15 years ago,
Sure.
when I started talking about the emotional impact of the choices we make, I often say to groups, you know, there's a human being on the other end of every assessment decision you make, and that human being is going to have an emotional reaction to the prospect of being assessed or whatever you decide to do in assessment. The question is that emotional reaction going to be productive? Like, do they see this as an opportunity, or is it going to be something that's counterproductive? Do they see assessment as something to be feared? When I
Yeah.
started tapping into that emotional side of assessment and realizing it for myself, and then
Sure.
relaying that message to others, what I noticed is that started to impact people. So just again, whenever you're trying to make change happen in any situation, we have to make both the technical and the emotional argument for why this is a more effective way to go. And that is the difference when you have people, even the most hardened, armed, folded,
Yeah.
they still care about their students and they
Sure.
want what's best for them. And if you can reach them emotionally, then you'll reach them technically.
I think your maturity around this and just your experience has taught you one that you are that teacher. So it's not a judgment, right? It's like, okay, this is a behavior. And so if you've evolved, you know that these people can evolve. And from what I'm hearing is you don't take it personally because again, you are that teacher. And the
Right.
other piece is the technical piece, like you talked about, that's the head, but you got to do the other thing and touch the heart.
Yeah,
And you
absolutely.
put those together, then that's a beautiful marriage, and you can help more people move forward.
Yeah. John Haidt, who wrote the book, The Happiness Hypothesis, uses the analogy in the book um, that it's like change is like riding an elephant. The rider is our intellect, and whenever the elephant is doing what the rider wants, the rider thinks it's in charge. So if the rider wants the elephant to turn right and the elephant goes right, the rider thinks it's in charge, the intellect. But if the rider wants to go right, but the elephant wants to go left, you're definitely going left.
Yeah.
So it's an analogy. I know it's not the best analogy. Riding elephants is a little outdated,
Well,
but the idea being that the emotional side of change is going to definitely have greater impact. So we have to remind ourselves that leadership is really about reaching the emotions and making people feel that the human touches that shape, as Rosabeth Moss Cantor says, shape a positive emotional climate. The structures are good, the systems are good. Daniel Goleman writes about this too, is that whenever we talk about leaders,
Sure.
we always talk about strategy and vision, but it really isn't that. It's the emotions. It's how they made us feel, but it's both. We have to have the technical sides.
Sure.
We have to know what we're talking about. But yeah, the emotional side to me was the key, and I don't take it personally, because I often say to people, I said this to an audience yesterday, Brian. I said to them, the difference between you and I is that I'm not smarter than you. I have a 20-year head start on you. This is my 20th year of being completely immersed in this assessment work. So I just have longevity. It doesn't mean that I know more than you. Back in 2003, 2004, 2005, I didn't know anything about assessment. I was just learning, building the plane as I was flying. I was doing what I could to make things happen. And 20 years later, I'm here, and I feel like I have a good competence around assessment. But you have to be patient with people, right? Urgency. This is a mantra I've often used, Brian, is urgency for the ideas, but patience with people.
Yeah.
Because we have to have the conversations, but we have to be patient. People have to unlearn some things, and they get very defensive and they get emotional about, does that mean the 17 years of my career has been wrong and all that? And we have to help them navigate through all of that.
Well, and that's perfectly said. And I think it's also important to, for me, I always think about, why did most people get into this profession? It was about emotion. It's because they want to change kids' lives. So that's an emotional, kind of reaction to why I'm doing this work. And so if you have all that emotion tied up in it, and then somebody says, well, you're doing, quote, doing something wrong, then like you said, you're going to get defensive. And so I think, helping people, as you said, have time to process and to unlearn some things that they have entrenched into their practices, does take time.
Yeah. And part of it too is because very few of us have had any assessment and grading training. I mean, there's a lot of assessment training now. When I ask audiences, I'll say, how many of you had a class on assessment in your training? And a lot more hands are going up now than they used to.
Right.
But then I ask them this question: how many of those classes spent more than one day on grading? And almost every hand drops. And so because we had to make this up for ourselves and go into our autobiography, and most teachers were successful in school to some degree, we bring those practices and we take it very personally when someone questions them, because we were the ones that decided. We don't typically do that with reading strategies, because somebody comes along and says, hey, here's a more effective way to teach reading. Right. We go, okay, that's how we should teach reading. Yeah. But we get very emotional about our grading and our assessment practices because we weren't trained in it. So therefore we kind of made it up, and we get very attached to them. We often conflate our identities with our grading practices. Like, sure, how I grade is not what I do. It's actually who I am. It's how I forge a persona. Yeah. So it is very emotional for sure.
Yeah. I had a professor in college one time he said right the first day of class, he said, I only give 10% of the class A's.
Yeah.
And everybody's looking around like, oh my God, like he just shot us down right there. Like, okay, why should I try? I'm just going to try to get a B or C.
That's the illusion of rigor, right? The fewer kids that have A's, the more rigorous my class is. I mean, you and I went to college at a different era, a different generation, but that era of sort of, bell curves and restrictions and all of that are just so misguided.
Hey, in your book, you talk about this 3-tier framework. We talk about assessment, you talk about the PLC at work process, and you talk about the RTI at work process. Can you talk a little bit about how you married those together and made sure that they were kind of seamless, because they were? And I think sometimes people, these are separate things, and it's like, no, these are things that we need to use in concert with each other.
Right, because the work around accountability was in pockets. People would say to me, this is just one more thing we have to do. And I'm like, you're actually perfectly aligned. And those 3 elements really help perfectly align. So I'll kind of work toward obviously the assessment part, right? We have to separate achievement. We have to have criteria. If we're going to teach kids to be responsible, self-directed, respectful, all of those different characteristics, or what some call the habits of learning or profile of a learner, we have to have criteria. We have to be able to observe it. So the assessment part is, I think, pretty obvious. But here's the other part I said to people. If you've implemented the PLC at work structure, you've got your collaborative teams and your school is a PLC, you're guided by 4 questions. The first question is, what do we want kids to know and be able to do? Well, the answer to that question doesn't have to be academic.
Yeah.
Right. So what do we want kids to know and be able to do? We want them to learn to be responsible. How will we know that they're being responsible? What do we do for the kids who are still being irresponsible? And how do we transfer or support the kids who are already showing levels of responsibility? Those 4 guiding questions make you perfectly aligned to seamlessly work in this area. Now, the RTI, PBIS, MTSS, 3-tiered continuum it's all the same fundamental. And what we have to understand is that when it comes to anything we do, it's not going to work for everyone. So I often phrase it this way, Brian. I often say to people, when you're addressing this issue of late work, missing work, accountability, you're going to have to put systems in place that are not going to work for the students you're thinking of.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is when we implement tier 1 supports, and I know you know this well, but for your audience as reminders, tier 1 supports, everyone receives tier 1. The most effective tier of intervention is prevention. That's tier 1. But we know that our success threshold at tier 1 is about 80% or higher. If we can get an 80% response rate or higher, that really does help us redirect our attention. So if we can get success at 80%, we're not happy with that, but it does tell us if I get an 80% or 90% success rate, I direct my attention to the other 20%. But if we're getting a 50, what's that?
I think in your book, you said this before you go into tier 2.
Yeah.
You said it takes the pressure off of teachers because teachers don't have to be perfect. Like they have to get everybody, there the first time around.
It sure does. Because when you and I often talk about this with people, it's like, you can't just know about the 3 tiers. You have to live it. You have to understand that when you make a command of your class, you say, all right, everybody, open up to page 76. We're going to get started on chapter 12 today. You should, in your head, immediately think to yourself, about 80% of my kids are going to do that on first command.
Right.
Then I'm probably going to have to go over to a small group. Like this tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 can happen in 30 seconds. I can make a command of my class, go over to the group of 4 that's still talking. That's targeted group-based intervention for tier 2. And then I might go over to that one student, pick up the textbook and open it up to page 76 in chapter 12. That can happen in 30 seconds. So I think when you start to teach with the 3-tiered framework in mind, again, it's not that we're happy with 80%. We'd like it to be higher because that's going to have a ripple effect. But it does take the pressure off and makes you, especially a new teacher, realizing that you're not less than as a teacher if not everybody follows your direction. It's normal. The phrasing I use often, Brian, is that the framework, the 3-tiered framework, which is really just a graphic organizer and thinking, but the 3-tiered framework is anticipatory.
Sure.
By identifying tier 2 and tier 3, there is an anticipation that tier 1 is not going to work for everybody. If we thought there was one strategy that could work for everybody, then we would do that. But because tier 2 and tier 3 are identified, there's an anticipation that some students will be unresponsive to those tiers, right? So tier 1 is a tier of prevention. So we're going to put systems in place. We're going to hold kids accountable. It's not going to work for the students we're thinking of, but we need to set the tone. We need to create an environment of excellence. Tier 2 is for those who are chronic in terms of repeated. Like some students need longer to learn, some students lack some skills, but some students have chronic challenges. And so we need to be very targeted with those students. We often deliver that in a group-based model, not because tier 2 is required to be group-based, but because it's a more efficient delivery model.
And especially want to make sure that if it's tier 2, it's group-based, then it's on a particular skill. Like we don't have
no, it's not groups. It's
all these
groups
different
with similar. Yes, they have similar needs, and that creates the efficiency, right? It's each tier is subsequently more labor intensive. So it's in our best interest to group kids with similar needs. So therefore it's a more efficient delivery. You're absolutely right. Like that. And then tier 3 is of course individualized or personalized. And that we build. So tier 2, we have a system that exists and we fit the students into the system. Tier 3 is we build the system for the student. Again, more labor intensive. So it's in our best interest, efficiency. If people are worried about time,
Right.
That's why we invest in tier one. But what's going to happen is you're going to have a small group of students still be unresponsive and they'll need tier three supports. But the question is, are you going to be able to go deep with those students? Or because we've been loose at tier one, loose at tier two, have you inadvertently and falsely escalated the number of kids who appear to need tier three intervention? And now it's triage. Now we're just trying to service a huge volume of kids. So keeping this in mind, because what's interesting is when it's academic, we tend to have a lot of tolerance. Like I often say to people, when kids have an academic misunderstanding, our traditional responses or our typical responses are, hey, let me help you, let me show you, let me teach you, right? When a student has a behavioral misstep, our responses tend to be the exact opposite. It's stop that, don't do that, that's irresponsible. So why can't we, when a student has a behavioral misstep, why can't we say, let me help you, let me show you, let me teach you? That's the whole premise behind the book, is if we want kids to learn to be responsible, then we need to teach them. This is, and I'll finish. I know I'm being a bit long-winded here, Brian, but I'll finish this thought.
Great.
When we're teaching, we're often teaching, but when we're teaching responsibility, we often do the opposite. Like when people say we're teaching them about responsibility, I say, well, what do you do? They say, well, penalize late work. So what else do you do? We give them zeros. The way we approach responsibility traditionally is it's like this. I'll use an academic example to see if this makes sense to anybody, and I know it doesn't. I'm going to teach you math by punishing your inability to do math.
Yeah, it doesn't
that
make
makes no sense.
It's almost laughable, right?
It's laughable. But then as soon as we bring it over into the behavioral realm, we say, we're going to teach you responsibility by punishing your irresponsibility.
Yeah.
And we just kind of look around at each other and go, yeah, that's how we've always done it. That's how it works. We have to at least be able to question that and challenge that. If we're going to teach them responsibility, then teach them what it means to be more organized in advance of a deadline. So the whole premise of the book is this. It's not okay for kids to miss deadlines, but it's equally not okay for a teacher to distort the achievement level of that learner as a result of the lateness. We need to teach them the skills that they need so that they can be successful in college, they can be successful in life. So I'm with people when they say we need to teach them responsibility. It might be the method where we might disagree.
Hey, trying to rephrase this question, in the PLC at work process, when we have teams come together around academic skills or anything that they've taught and they've assessed, and they come back together and they have conversations around what student needs to have additional time support to master this essential, skill. Do we have an opportunity when we talk about behavior skills to have teams come together and talk about, okay, in my class, these skills that we said are so essential, only 60% of the students seem to be mastering these skills or demonstrating proficiency. But in my colleagues' class, it seems like 90%. Should we have that conversation? Because sometimes it's not the kids, it's the teachers. And it's not, again, I'm not indicting a teacher. It might be the teacher's lack of being able to teach those skills appropriately.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. We can talk about it. I think there's a couple of things that we need to do in order to have meaningful conversations. And I agree, Brian, it's not an indictment. It's not anything like that. There's a big difference between a critique and a criticism, right? I mean, critique, we're just looking at what's not working and whether it's not a blame thing.
It's just on this one skill. Maybe they're
right.
Another skill, but just this one thing. They're saying they're not getting it from me. I need some help.
How do I help? So talking about things, I think there's a couple things we need. Obviously, we need to establish what we mean when we say certain things. When we say responsibility, we need some definition around it. We need to make sure that we are all clear and in agreement as to what that looks like and what the criteria is. What will we see? What is observable? What will we notice about a student who is responsible? So that's the first thing. We need specificity and clarity in terms of establishing criteria. So we all have a baseline in terms of what we're looking for.
Right.
But the other part that I think often gets lost in these behavioral conversations is there's this kind of expression or saying that I learned years ago called explanatory fictions. And what an explanatory fiction is these almost hyperbolic statements that don't really help with any planning or any goal setting. So for example, if I come into a meeting and I just say, oh my gosh, these kids are just so hyperactive.
Right.
Well, hyperactive doesn't help. It's not measurable, right?
Yeah.
So we would have to ask, what does that look like? And then we want to drill down to a place where a teacher might say, well, I got 4 or 5 kids in my class who seem to start 5 or 6 different things in a half an hour,
Yeah.
right? We need he's hyperactive, he's disruptive. Well, what does that look like? Because that's how you're going to measure success. If I can say, for example, I have a student in my class who initiates 4 different tasks within a 30-minute period of time. If
Right.
I could reduce that to 2, or if I could reduce that to 4 in an hour, that's progress.
Yeah.
It's not the desirable, but it's definitely making progress. So when we speak to one another about our students, we want to speak not in these explanatory fictions, but we want to talk in ways that are specific and measurable so we can know whether or not we're having success with them. And that to me is the
Sure.
key, is that the more specific you can talk about, and for all listeners and viewers right now, if you're ever asked to, and which many of you are, to sit in an IEP meeting or talk about students, whether it's academic or behavioral supports, be as specific as you can about what you're observing, because these hyperbolic statements or these general explanatory fictions are not helpful in planning or setting goals or knowing whether or not a student is making. And the key is, Brian, we know what the end result will look like. It's the incremental steps along the way that become very hard to identify if we can't get specific about what the teacher's noticing to begin with. So specificity and criteria, and then specificity in what we're observing. And that would make for a very productive conversation about how do you teach it? What do you do? How often do you interact with the students? Tell me what you're doing so I can try to replicate some of that, because you clearly are having some success. And
Sure.
I'd love to replicate that success in my classroom.
Love that. Hey, in your book, in the prioritizing and reporting on behavior
Yeah.
attributes, chapter 6, one of the things that I think sometimes teachers will say is this, like you said earlier, this is just another thing to take my time away from
Yeah.
actually assessing and reporting on academics. And you have a couple different ways of doing it. I like I think it's figure 6.1, and you talk about how you can not have them at the same time in terms of the report cards. He said, you said like the behavioral attributes, maybe do it on a trimester basis. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because if, as you say, sometimes parents see behavior in academics on the same progress report, then they don't prioritize the behavior information as much as they do the academic information.
Yeah, it really is a choice. I presented that as an idea
Yeah.
because there is an upside and downside to both. Okay, so the idea of separating the behavioral reporting from the academic reporting is that when that report is put in front or made accessible online, that's the only thing that parents are focused on. So of course they'll give their attention to it, and it'll raise its profile and its prioritization amongst families and all that. That's the upside. The potential downside with that is that teachers are going to feel like they're in a constant state of reporting because they just did the academic report card, and
Right.
now it's the behavioral report, and then it's the academic report. So it really is a choice. But you're
Right.
right. The downside of having it all on one report, we do these epic report cards 3-4 times a year, and it's these monumental events that really burn teachers out. It ruins their weekends and the whole thing. We've got to be more efficient with that for sure. So the downside of that is the behavioral elements get lost. The upside is that we're not in as much of a cycle of reporting.
Sure.
So I think schools have to decide what is most effective and efficient for their system. But here's the thing, Brian. If we want students to take, I often hear this from people, Tom, the kids don't take that behavioral stuff seriously. Well, part of the reason they don't take it seriously is because we don't give it enough attention and we don't prioritize it. What adults give their attention to is what kids will think is important. So we have to give it the attention. And if we can raise its profile by either separating or maybe repositioning it on the report card, like the real estate on the report card is quite valuable. And if it's near the top, or if it's, you make a lot of statements by what you position on a report card.
Kind of
So
like when you go into a grocery store, how
correct.
they in like different products, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think it's a choice, but I do like that idea, because I do think the upside is that 3 times a year, the only quote unquote report that a student would be, or a family would be looking at, is the one about the student's habits of learning or their behavioral attributes. And I think that's favorable. I think there would be some positive to that. So what I would say to principals or teachers that are thinking about that model of separating out the reporting, we have to make sure there's efficiency in how we do that, because we don't want to burn people out just in this constant state of reporting.
We've talked a lot about teachers and students. But I think the other piece is, how do we help parents understand this?
Yeah.
Because just sending them a progress report with this new information on it,
Yeah.
they're going to say, well, what is this? So do we, do this through parent teacher conferences, through back to school nights, all these, opportunities for parents to learn about how we're going to separate and really pay attention to, behavior.
Yeah.
I think it's important, but, do you have any other ideas on how we do this with parents?
Yeah. I think we have to be, we have to make sure that, well, let me put it this way. The more information you make available to parents, the more efficient the reporting can be.
Yeah.
So if we have on our website, we have, here are the, 3 to 5 habits of learning that we're really focused on. That's not the only ones we'll ever talk about, but
Right.
those are the ones we're going deeper with, right? We're going deep on these 4. We provide them with the criteria or the rubrics that we're using. We provide them with, here's actually how we teach them. So we show them, we link up the process for how we teach. This is our rotation. We teach every Monday. There's a mini lesson on these habits of learning. And so the more detail that you provide, the more detail you provide to your families, then your reporting system can be quite efficient. They go, oh, I see, respect, responsibility, self-directedness, collaborative. They'll just look at that and go, oh, okay, I see where you are, because I've had access to all the other information that was made available to me.
Yeah.
If you don't do that front end loading, then you're probably going to have to put more on the reporting, the report. I call it a report card, but it's not really an academic report card, but I put it on the behavioral report. And that's going to create some inefficiencies, because as that document expands, it gets longer and parents are going to have to read more. Again, it's probably something that we have to be realistic about how much time. It's not that people don't care about their kids. They do. We would all say, well, isn't your child, isn't an hour worth your child? Yes, it is. But most people don't spend an hour on the report card.
Exactly.
So we want to be efficient for the family. So I think the smartest thing to do and the most effective thing to do is make sure that parent teacher night, open houses, website, student planner,
Yeah.
the process for how we teach these habits of learning is well laid out and made very clear, so that you can just reference that, so that the report can be an efficient delivery model.
Yeah. This has been great, Tom. I really appreciate it. I have one more question
Sure.
about your book, and then we're going to wrap, because I know you have some things to do. And but I do appreciate your time this morning. In your book, you talk about this idea of ensuring that norms are culturally expansive.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think sometimes when we create some of these behaviors, or we identify some of these behaviors, um, depending on what kids we're talking about and where culture they're coming from,
Yeah.
some of the behaviors may be to us, and you talk about the white Eurocentric view,
Sure.
maybe outside the norm, but in their own culture, it is the norm.
Right. I have to give credit to Zaretta Hammond. She is a brilliant woman, and I learned this from her, because in having her on my podcast, I asked her a very simple question, which is, Zaretta, if we're going to be culturally responsive in our schools, what does a school do when they have, some of the overseas schools I work with, Brian, have 65, 70 cultures represented in their schools.
Yeah.
So I said, how does a teacher or a school attend to those cultures? She said, you can't, but here's what you do. You focus on cultural archetypes. And I said, okay, what does that mean? And in her book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, she does a brilliant job. Honestly, she's just, I can't speak highly enough about Zaretta.
Yeah. All the podcasts.
She's amazing. And what I learned was, the 2 cultural archetypes. There's the cultures that emphasize the written tradition, and then there's the cultures that emphasize the oral tradition. That doesn't have a ton to do with the behavioral side, but academically, from an assessment perspective. So there's an assessment derivative of this as well.
Right.
But then on the other side, there's the cultures that emphasize the individual, and there's cultures that emphasize the collective. That's the, say, x-axis or y-axis that I was focusing on.
Right.
So in school, for example, if I come from a culture where we emphasize the collective, when someone is struggling, I help them.
Yeah.
In school, we call that cheating.
Yeah.
And that's because most of the white Eurocentric lens of school comes out of an individual emphasis, the emphasis on the individual.
Yeah.
So what I want schools to do, and I don't, Brian, pretend to be an expert in this area, but it's a field that I think is very important for us to talk about, which is the fact that when you look at most, let's just break it right down. When you look at most school rules, they really come from the lens of sit down, be quiet, don't disrupt. It really does emphasize the individual.
Right.
And I think that schools would be wise to audit their expectations or their school rules to say one of two things. One is, where do we have some opportunities to emphasize the collective? I'm not saying cheating is okay. Okay.
Right.
So please don't misunderstand. Could we expand our expectations to say there are times where we can emphasize the collective, right? Are there times where we're not? So we either provide the outlet by talking, more talk time, more conversation time, telling our stories, things that really do emphasize the collective. Or if it's something that we really can't change, like cheating, maybe we can just tone down our response when a student who is from a culture that emphasizes the collective. We
Sure.
don't have to be so harsh about it, because we have to understand where that student is coming from. They looked over and they saw someone struggling and they wanted to help them. It
Yeah.
wasn't malicious in its intent. So I think that lens of just doing one of two things, either expanding what we say, well, and it really comes down to this, Brian. What do we mean by good behavior in school?
Right.
That
Right.
has been traditionally defined as, good behavior. And then there's derivatives, right? Dress codes,
Sure.
hairstyles,
Yeah.
all of those things have been defined through that very narrow white Eurocentric lens, because that's the tradition of North American schools, came out of the churches of Europe in the Middle Ages. Like we could trace this stuff back. So to at least have a conversation to say, let's look at our expectations. Where are we too culturally narrow?
Yeah.
Where can we expand? And if we can't expand, can we look at how we respond to what we deem to be missteps, and maybe not get so over the top in how we approach the redirection of students and the reteaching of students? That, yes, we want you to help people. We want you but in this environment, in a testing environment or in an assessment environment, it isn't okay to just lean over and help somebody in that situation. So we coach them and we teach them and we show them compassion and we empathize or show them understanding, that we understand where they're coming from and we know what their intent was, or we appreciate that their intent wasn't malicious. So we either expand what we mean by good behavior, or we begin to look at how we respond to those situations where there is some cultural fuzziness in terms of, it isn't just about the individual, just about the collective, but there's some gray areas there where we could be a little bit more, say, compassionate and a little bit more understanding about what's going on.
Again, just like you just said, it's about understanding. I had somebody talk to me not long ago about having students in their class call out. And every time they were calling out, and most of the students who were calling out were African-American students.
Yeah.
And then one parent came in, because she called home, and one parent came in and said, in our Black churches, when the pastor is speaking, it is actually a good thing for us, the people in the pews, to call out and affirm that speaker. That's what we do. That person had no clue. And so just talking about, again, having an understanding of different cultures, really, and I'm not saying all Black people do that, but I'm just saying in that instance, it really was like an aha to that person. That person was like, I had no idea. And this is part of their cultural, experience.
Absolutely. It's just trying to, rather than being, we're so often quick to jump to the punitive, instead of asking questions and finding out, where did this come from and what were you thinking, and just help me understand. And as a teacher or as a principal, you can learn a lot and be open to learning from your students.
Sure.
About what is a cultural norm for them.
Yeah.
And how that plays out. And you learn to appreciate that, and you learn to embrace it. And I think that's part of our growth as educators and as human beings.
Exactly. It's called Redefining Student Accountability, everybody. You got to get this book. It's an awesome book. Before we go, you have a podcast that is just blown up. You have, I looked on the other day, I think how many episodes have you gotten to? Like 100?
108. Got 108 episodes.
Over 100. That's just amazing. And so
108 episodes. I'm just grateful for everyone that's chosen 100. I think it's like we're up to like 120,000 downloads or whatever. So
that's amazing.
I'm really, I love it. It's really hard to do now with all the writing projects and things like that. I've had to sort of pull back. I started the podcast like 25,000 other people during COVID.
Yeah.
And it was easier to do when we were stuck at home. And now with the traveling, and I'm on the road for, a couple of weeks at a time and trying to schedule interviews and doing solo episodes, it's become more challenging. But I do love doing it. And I have a lot of appreciation for the listening audience. I have a very loyal listening audience. My numbers are pretty consistent each week. So that tells me there's people that keep coming back. So I really appreciate that.
You do a great job. And I think I told you a long time ago that, you helped me get through my exercise on the Stairmaster.
That's right. I remember those pictures you'd send me when you'd be on the Stairmaster, the treadmill or whatever, and you'd be like, yeah, another episode of the Tom Schimmer podcast. So I appreciate that, Brian. Yeah. And likewise, to reciprocate, these conversations that you're having are wonderful, impactful. I know the viewers really appreciate I know you've had Anthony on, you've had so many other great guests on. So I'm just honored to be a part of that, because I know that the people you've had on your conversations with Brian are top notch. And so thank you for inviting me.
Well, I appreciate that, Tom. And as I say at the end of each one of my podcasts, again, I shared this at my dad's funeral 3 years ago, that African proverb, as I go, I am wearing you. And, all the people that I have coming, contact throughout my life, people who have helped me, I am wearing them. And, with and again, we talked about this before, we've never met in person, but I feel like I've known you for my entire life, but I think it's just your passion, your grace, your humility, your wisdom, kindness, you just have like a general goodness about you, and just all the people that you're helping, including me. And so I am wearing Tom Schimmer, of course, as I go and do whatever I do. Your work on assessment, your new book, but all the things that you've done just help me become a better educator and a better person. So I appreciate that so much.
Thank you, Brian. That's very kind of you to say. We all learn from each other. And there's things about your work around, the influences that we both had from Yvette Jackson, but the work that you do in terms of deepening the idea that all kids are gifted and we should provide them with that. I've learned a ton from you as well. So yes, we've never met in person, but I feel like we're friends. I feel like we know each other. And I love the idea of just continuing to learn from one another, learn from everybody who we come into contact with. And that's a wonderful proverb. So I love that.
Yep. So thanks for coming on a conversation with Brian, and we'll see you very soon.
All right. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Tom.
Subscribe to A Conversation with Brian on my YouTube channel and Spotify.